Thank you very much. That was terrific. And I would really welcome people to ask questions. We have 2 volunteers in the back who have microphones. They're going to move throughout the crowd, and so they'll come to you if you just raise your hand. I'll start out with a question while they kind of get organized here. Steve, why do we hear such radically different estimates about how long it will take for this system to get in trouble? Basically, you're saying 2042 is the year at which it runs out of funds. But the president is going around the country saying this is a very urgent problem, and we hear estimates that, in the next decade or 2, we will be in serious trouble.
Well, when you're working in the government, there are lots of different ways of looking at things. There are different perspectives, and one of the ways that people in government look at the nation's finances, obviously, is the budget of the overall government, not just Social Security finances sort of in the small, but the budget as a whole. And right now, as we mentioned before, Social Security does have more tax money coming in than it has benefits paying out. And for the overall unified budget of the government, that is a plus. It means that there's extra money coming in from Social Security, so some other programs might be spending more than they're taking in. Now, that money does go into the trust funds, and it is a commitment for Social Security for future years. But from a budget perspective, this is kind of a plus for the government. Now, this sort of excess level of taxes coming in for Social Security will continue at its current level only through about 2008, and at about 2009 the amount of excess taxes will actually start to sort of decline at that point. And in 2017, that's the year when I mentioned earlier, when the taxes alone will not be enough to pay Social Security benefits. Now, from the point of view of paying Social Security benefits, frankly, this doesn't really matter because there's no question but that the trust funds will be available. Actually, starting last year, the Medicare Trust Fund, the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, reached the point where its taxes were not enough to pay, and they've been dipping into the trust fund all of last year and this year so far. I don't think anybody really much noticed that. Obviously, that works. It's worked before. Social Security has several times in the past tapped into the trust funds, and if we get to that point, it'll happen again, and it'll be seamless. Secretary Snow, Department of Treasury said absolutely those trust fund assets are backed by the full faith and credit of the government. However, there will be strains on the budget that will occur starting in 2009 when the excess of Social Security starts to diminish and then crosses over, and Social Security actually starting to on net draw money out of the general fund or the Treasury. So that's something which as a nation we'll have to sort of face. But in terms of solvency of Social Security, that's really not an issue in that regard.
But we should also make sure that people really understand when we say the Social Security Trust Fund, there really isn't one. I mean, if I create a trust fund for my family, I have to put money in there. In terms of this trust fund, it's basically an IOU that the government gets the money from Social Security payroll taxes, uses it to pay Social Security, obviously, but also for other things in the government, and then says, I will pay back that money to the Social Security Trust Fund, correct?
Well, if there's anybody you're going to sort of loan some money to and be dependent upon them making good on giving it back, probably the U.S. government's a pretty good place, right? Full faith and credit. Well, we'll see some not so sure. The government hasn't reneged on any securities yet, and I think we really can expect it not to in the future. That really probably shouldn't be an issue. There is some discussion about the idea of one part of government owing another part of government money, and there is something to that in terms of the overall economic implications. But in terms of the money being available for Social Security when it needs it, I think there's really no question about that. The money will absolutely be available. As far as the idea of are these real assets, is the money invested, if you go give money to a savings and loan and they loan it to your neighbor to buy a house, it's not sitting there in a pile of dollars. The value of that asset that you've loaned the money to the savings loan is the ability of that savings loan to go out and to get the money when you want to draw it out of your account. And the government is really in the same position. The value of money that any of us or the Social Security Trust Funds loans to the government is the ability of the government to go and to make good on that and come up with the money at a later time. And there really shouldn't be any question about that.
Okay. I don't know who has a microphone near them. Would you get this gentleman, please? Would you stand? Would you mind? He needs to hang on to it. And please, we need to kind of keep these to questions as opposed to speeches from anybody. Thank you.
If you increase the retirement age to 66, what would happen?
Okay, well, actually, we just got done with that. So right now, for people who are reaching eligibility for Social Security this year in 2005 at 62, their normal retirement age is 66. And sort of a shorthand thing. This is sort of like an actuary kind of number, sorry. But when you raise the retirement age by 1 year, if you raise the normal retirement age by 1 year, that reduces benefits by between about 6 and 7%. And remember earlier that as we look into the future, we're going to have enough money after the baby boomers have retired and the new lower fertility rates have taken over. We're going to be short something like about 25% in benefits. Well, raising the retirement age 1 extra year actually lowers benefits by between 6 and 7%. So 1 year of retirement age is good for about 1/4 of the problem that we have going in the future. So you can attack the shortfall of Social Security by increasing the retirement age, but you'd have to increase it by 4, 5, 6 years in order to eliminate the long-range problems that we have now.
What was the life expectancy in 1940?
Back in 1940, as I think Margie or Bing indicated earlier, was about 13. I think it was about 12 and a half years was life expectancy at 65. And now the life expectancy at 65 is about 18 or 19. And we project it's going to go to, I think, something about like 24 years by the time we get out 75 years from now. So the numbers have increased fairly significantly, and that is affecting sort of the level of the cost of the program. But the really big shift is a result of the birth rates that have dropped. There will be some continuing very gradual increase in the cost of the system if we keep the retirement age where it is and we continue to have greater life expectancy. But that's something that we can really handle in a number of ways with some very, very tiny increments to retirement age in the future, very tiny increments to the benefit formula. The really big shift, the shift that you see between 2020 and 2030, is really all about the drop in the birth rates. Something over which we had control, but again, it's a choice our society made.
Yes, sir.
I'm interested in having you talk about extending the taxable maximum. My view that the Social Security tax is sort of prima facie regressive. Make it a little bit less regressive if you extend it to everybody. Certainly the 6% that make more than $90,000 or whatever the cutoff is make a lot more than 6% of the national income. So what would happen? If to the system if you just said everybody's in?
Okay, well, very good question. As the gentleman indicated, 6% of our workers make over $90,000, and actually their excess earnings over $90,000 represent about 15% of all the earnings that potentially could be taxed. If, for example, we were to say tomorrow, let's go in and we're going to have all the earnings. Bill Gates, bring them on, everybody. We're going to tax them 12.4% on everything. And in addition to taxing all of their earnings, we're not even going to give them any extra benefit credit. Let's go for the whole thing here. No extra benefit credit for earnings above $90,000, but we're going to tax you the full 12.4%. That would be enough to improve our sort of 75-year actuarial balance by 2.2% of payroll. And right now our shortfall is about 1.9% of payroll. So that would be more than enough to put the system in good financial shape for the next 75 years. Now, that's the good news. The not so good news is that, while it'd be good for 75 years, remember that trust fund ratio going up and going back down? It'd be going back down at the end of the period. So that alone, even if we were to do that, wouldn't be enough to really fix the system on a real sustainable basis. And you can sort of see that because at the end of 75 years, our actual shortfall between our tax level and our benefits is about 6% of payroll. If we were to really want to get the system on kind of a stable financing basis going out in the future, we'd have to either raise taxes by about half, from 12.4 up to about 18, raise it by almost 6%, or we'd have to cut benefits by about a third. So what would eliminating the taxable maximum do? At the end of 75 years, that would be equivalent to sort of increasing the overall taxes an amount equivalent to about 3% of payroll. It would take care of about half of the long-range sustainability problem, but it would carry us for the full 75 years. Now, if you were to go not quite that far and you'd say, now, wait a second. Bill Gates and the rest of these guys, we're going to tax them the 12.4, but let's give them some benefit credit too. Remember, the benefit credit would, in that case, generally be in this PIA formula. The PIA formula is a progressive formula. The first, several $100s of earnings you have for your average earnings, you get 90% of that in this basic benefit formula. The next, something like $3,000 after that, you get about 32%, about a third of it returned in terms of your benefit. And above around $3,700, $3,800 of average monthly earnings, you get only 15%. So by and large, if we gave benefit credit under the current benefit formula, you'd get only sort of 15% in extra credit towards benefits for the extra earnings that had been taxed. We would still save a lot of money. In this case, instead of that 2.2% of payroll, which is more than enough to fix things for 75 years, you'd get about 1.75% of payroll. Not quite enough to fix things for 75 years, but it'd take you a long way into the right direction. So there is a lot of potential here for increasing the taxable maximum. In and of itself, it's not enough to really do the job completely, but it certainly could be a substantial component of the provisions that might be put together for the next time that Social Security is changed.
I say if Bill antes up, we're probably all set. That's all we need. How about from some of the students who are here? Maybe yours? No, they're mute. Okay.
There's a guy with a camera.
Please stand, if you will.
Affect does that counter the low birth rate at all? Very much? Anticipated immigration.
About immigration, does that affect the birth rate?
It does, absolutely. I mean, currently, and we expect for the future, the number of births, the number of people born in this country are going to be about 4 million births per year, and immigration is about 1/4 that level. It's not insubstantial. We have about 1 million new people coming into the country. That is, people coming in over and above the number of people that leave the country. Some people actually leave the country on a year-to-year basis. But the net immigration to the country is about 1 million. It's actually been somewhat higher than that for the last 10 years. And ultimately, in our projections, we assume it's going to be around 1 million, maybe a little bit less than that. So immigration is a key component. And it's because of both having the birth rates continue at about 2 children per woman, which puts us at about 4 million births per year, plus the roughly 1 million immigration. The combination of those does give us a population that's slightly growing into the future, and that's a good thing. That does help with Social Security finances. And for that matter, it helps with financing private pensions and everything else in our society. This isn't just Social Security. So we are expecting to have some very slow growth in the working age population, but less than 1%, about 0.2% after 2025. And you're exactly right. If it weren't for having immigration in addition to the births, we would have really no growth in the working age population. So definitely a plus for immigration. And the other thing about immigration to remember is that immigrants come in and they get jobs or they don't get jobs, whatever. But when immigrants come in, on average, they're coming in their 20s. And when people come in their 20s as immigrants, by and large, they end up having children. And when they have children born in the United States, those are native-born citizens. So the real impact of immigrants isn't just their work and then they're later getting benefits or not, but it's actually the fact that they have children in this country. And if those children stay, that really does create more births and does create more growth for the population and more workers for the future.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering, I'm speaking for seniors. For 15 years or so, we've been hearing about reform. And now with this administration, it's become a bipartisan issue. And I just wonder why it shouldn't be that way when AARP is spending something like $5 million or more to convince people that it's not good. I think we need to hear more people like you. We're giving both sides.
Great. Well, thank you. I mean, our hope is that everybody will just sort of get the facts out there. I mean, I forget who this is attributed to. Somebody made the comment a while back that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. Yeah. And we have our trustees report. It's actually available online if you all are really interested. You can go to socialsecurity.gov. Kurt, did I get that right? Okay, excellent. I was chastised earlier by our local Boston guys here for giving like an acronym for Social Security. But socialsecurity.gov, and then if you put in /OACT in capital letters, you'll actually go to the Office of the Actuary website. And on there, you'll see, among other things, listed under publications, the latest trustees report. This is the annual report that our Board of Trustees puts out. As I think Bing indicated earlier, we do all the computations for it, and actually the Actuary's Office even does all the drafting of it. So we're we're responsible really largely for almost everything in the trustees report. The trustees come into play in sort of helping us select assumptions. They actually get the final call on the assumptions. But to show you how apolitical that process is actually, when you look at this trustees report, you'll see the last page in the trustees report. This has been, I think, since 1994. The last page in the trustees report is a place where the chief actuary, again, a non-political individual, has to sign off as to whether or not the assumptions and methods used for the projections in that report are thought to be reasonable individually and collectively. And the chief actuary has not only the right but the obligation, if any of the assumptions selected by the trustees are off the mark, thought to be political or biased in any way, to say so. And partly because we have this last page in the report, I'm happy to report to you that in the latest report that just came out on March 23, I gleefully signed that everything looks good because we do have very good projections, we think. They're very unbiased, and they do give us a very good and true picture of what we can expect for the future.
Let me ask you about the private accounts, because that's very much in the news today and a lot of discussion. Would they play a part in shoring up Social Security, or are they just completely, really a different issue?
You know, there's been a lot of discussion about the idea of individual accounts, and I didn't even sort of have them in the slideshow here, but individual accounts, it's like everything else in life. It depends on how you use them, how you do them. There are some plans out there, some congressional plans, that would actually have individual accounts where the money going into the accounts would not come from the Social Security trust funds. The money would come from the general fund or the Treasury. And if the money came from the general fund or the Treasury, that's still a cost. It's still real money, but it wouldn't take money out of the trust funds. So if the money came from the general fund or the Treasury and went into the individual accounts, and some of these plans actually then have, when you reach retirement age and you start drawing money out, the money would either pay to you and then your benefit would be reduced from Social Security, or one of the plans actually has the money coming out of your individual account and going directly into the trust funds to help finance Social Security benefits. Well, if you took this approach, there's no question but that individual accounts would in fact help the solvency of Social Security. It would really become a mechanism by which we'd have money coming from the general fund of the Treasury, building up and becoming advanced funding and saving in securities of various types that would later on help to finance Social Security benefits. So that is one way of approaching it that would directly speak to the financial status of Social Security.
It would help at this current time, but what about that money later on, when the younger people who are retiring, who would be calling on that money? Wouldn't that depend on whether those monies were successfully invested or not, that you would have that payback?
Well, it would, but then the question is really, I think what Margie's suggesting is sort of how much would it help? And that, of course, depends on how well invested the money was. The particular plan I'm thinking is one put forth by a member of Congress from the state of Florida, who until very recently was the chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee and the House Ways and Means Committee, a pretty influential place. And his plan would actually probably encourage people to put a lot of money into their accounts, or to put in what they could, and to invest it with some care, because the payoff when people reach retirement age would be that they'd get to keep 5% of whatever was there. So they'd probably want to, invest that to get a good return. The other 95% would go to the trust funds to help pay for benefits from Social Security. So there'd be an incentive for them to try to have that 5% be as big as possible. The other money would go to Social Security, and their plan actually would almost require people to invest something like 2/3 of the money that was in this individual account in the Social Security in corporate equities. Where we would expect that the rate of return on corporate equities is likely to be higher than on bond investments. But let me just talk for a minute, though, about what most of the plans for individual accounts are. And this is why you've probably all heard in the press that the White House has fairly recently been saying that you should not expect individual accounts per se to really make a substantial contribution towards the solvency of Social Security. And in the formulation that is most common for individual accounts, that is true. Because the most common formulation, in fact, the formulation that the President has put forward, and most of the plans that we've seen from Congress, would do really three things in the context of creating individual accounts. One is that money would come out of the trust funds from Social Security to say 2%, 3%, 4% of your pay would, while you're a worker, come out of the trust funds and be redirected to go into the individual account, and your individual account would build. And this would be your money. When you went to retire, that money would be available to you. You'd either take it out a little at a time or annuitize or whatever. So that's the first step. The second step is, well, we realize if we're going to take money out of the trust funds for today's workers, we're still going to have benefit payments for the current retirees and for people who will be retiring in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And if we're going to take a lot of money out of the trust funds, we'll deplete our trust funds sooner. They won't last till 2041. So a second feature that's in all of these plans is to say, well, wait a second. If we end up depleting the trust funds by redirecting money out of the trust funds into individual accounts, we've got a way to sort of make that back up to the trust funds. And the mechanism here is, in all these plans, to say that the general fund of the Treasury would provide money to the trust funds to make sure that it did not run out and it was able to continue paying the benefits. Now, here's really where the payoff of the individual account structure is. Once you've done that, because remember, individual accounts are just one of the mechanisms that are potentially available to create some advance funding for the Social Security program. The other way is to just have the trust funds themselves build up to a higher level and invest in equities, and that's another option. President Clinton considered that and actually put that on the table as a proposal several times. But if we do it through individual accounts and we have the money going out into the individual accounts, we have to first backfill it with some money from the general fund of the Treasury to keep the trust funds whole. But eventually we wouldn't have to keep that money coming in, because all these plans have another feature. They say, if you and you and you and Margie and Bing and I all say, yes, we voluntarily want to go for the individual account, part of the deal is we've got to be willing then to have some reduction in our remaining Social Security benefit at a later time, sort of quid pro quo here. If you're going to have money redirected to your individual account and have it invested and benefit from that, you're going to have to accept a reduction to your Social Security benefit. And generally the way these reductions are structured is that if you have $1 coming out today to go to your individual account and you invest that and you hope to do well and have great returns on that, the government will remember that $1 that came out today, and it will increase it at a certain sort of specified rate in sort of a hypothetical account. And then when you go to retire, it'll remember that $1 increased at a specified rate. The president's plan, I think, would suggest 3% over inflation. And it will increase it at 3% over inflation and then deduct that from your benefits once you reach retirement. So the real question then becomes very simple for you as an individual. If you're going to engage in the individual accounts in this kind of an approach, then you've got to say, do I think I can invest and do better than 3% over inflation? So if you're an aggressive investor, historically your answer would be that you'd expect probably that will be the case. But of course the key is there are no guarantees. So if we have individual accounts and we have this kind of a structure where you have money coming out of the trust funds in your individual account and you accept a benefit reduction later on as a result of that, the question is how successful you'll be as an investor. Our estimate is that by and large people will do better, but there are no guarantees, and not everybody and not every generation will do better. So there would be more variability under the structure.
Hi, I have excuse me, my voice is going too. And I'm a student, by the way. Some of us are old and students. I'm a little uncomfortable with the conversation about, I believe you said, women not having or are having less children. And what about employers and corporations? Now, every bit of money that I earn, a percentage goes into this trust fund, but my employer pays an equal amount of job. So, I mean, when a person is not working, when they're unemployed or their company collapses or goes overseas, they're not putting in. I also have a question of, when a corporation takes its production to another country, they're not paying into the system here. So I guess I'm concerned about corporate responsibility for the system.
Gee, that's a good question. It's a question that really relates to much more than Social Security. And I guess one possibility on that is we are, because of lower birth rates, we are an aging society now, and this is, imagine if we were all the board of directors here in a big corporation. As we go into the future with a lower birth rate and with a still growing population, especially as we're all getting older and living longer and longer, if we perceive that there's a relative shortage of number of workers available, we probably will look beyond our borders for additional workers. We're already doing it, and we'll probably do it to an increasing extent. This really is not so much a Social Security issue as it is a matter of we're becoming really a world community now, and American workers are in competition with workers all over the world. And this is in part because corporations and investments can go anywhere in the world now. For a long time in this country, we enjoyed sort of this landlocked sort of, island nation, and much of the rest of the world was in political upheaval most of the time. It's wonderful now. The Cold War is over. We're not subject to lots of fears and risks and concerns about as much political upheaval and as much military problems around the world as was once the case. For those of us that remember the Cold War, one of the prices of that, though, is that the rest of the world has more stable economic environments, and investors all around the world are more willing to invest in India and China than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. That being the case, we as workers in the United States are going to be more challenged in more direct competition.
Well, a lot of countries around the world are in fact having to deal with this problem, as you mentioned earlier. How does that affect us? Are they having more difficulty than we are? Or have any of them come up with some really good plans?
It's you mean in terms of the overall sort of job structure, or in terms of Social Security?
Social Security, yeah.
Well, for Social Security, we continue to have, the United States has a very vibrant economy, and we still have very low unemployment rates in this country, between 4 and 5%. Basically, people who want to have a job, generally are able to find jobs in our economy. There does not appear to be a problem in terms of finding employment for people who want to have jobs. And if people have jobs, then they and their employers, as indicated, pay taxes into Social Security, and we keep on going. So I think probably as a nation we would not want to preclude domestically based corporations from going abroad to find additional sources of labor as long as people are being fully employed in this country.
Okay. Could you get to... Okay. I want to get some people other than just the edge people. So, but you're going to get that gentleman, and then this other fellow in the hat has had his hand up for a long time. Go ahead. You in the back row, please. No.
Here you go.
You can... We'll get back to you.
I got the whole... Okay. I wanted to know the types of stipulations that are set in regards to having funds routed to some sort of a individual account as opposed to completely into Social Security, and also is that portion of the fund, is it liquid to the individual as far as do they have access to that kind of money themselves, for whatever reason?
Well, the formulations that we've seen so far from members of Congress all over the place, and were actually even considered in the Clinton administration, because they were looking very seriously at individual account possibilities. The thought of the individual accounts is, as I mentioned before, it's one of the two possible ways to create some advance funding, to sort of have more money being saved up for the purpose of Social Security benefits in the future. Now, if you're going to do that, we can't do it like the 401ks and the IRAs have sort of evolved over time, where if people have some good reason and are willing to accept a penalty, they can tap into it when they're in their 30s or their 40s or their 50s. Because if they do that, that money's not going to be available in retirement. The formulations we've seen so far is that if we have individual accounts and the money goes into these accounts, you will not be able to touch it, period, until you reach retirement age, at least 62, maybe even 65. The only exception to that in the structures that we've seen so far would be is if you die before reaching retirement age and don't have a spouse. Because the plans we've seen so far would even go as far as saying that if you die, say, at age 40 and you have money in your account, that money will simply transfer to your spouse's account, so that they'll have a larger account towards their retirement. The idea is to have this money saved up for retirement purposes. Only if you die and don't have a spouse, then would it go to your estate. And even that would be an option. Some plans have suggested, well, if you die and don't have a spouse to go into their account, then have the money simply go back to the Social Security trust funds. That'll be a possibility. Generally, that is not where most plans have gone, because one of the stated objections to the individual accounts is to have ownership and wealth, so that when you reach retirement age, you'll have this sort of pot of money that will be available to you.
Okay. Yes.
You have made some calculations about how the federal government would gain some money by not covering, by covering state and local government employees. And that's because you're going to have some money coming in, and that's of some considerable importance. Have you made any calculations or conjectures about what other effects doing that would have? For instance, as an example, maybe the state governments would be able to lower their benefits and contributions, or what effect it might have on other parts of the relations between the federal and the state governments.
Well, we do know that in a number of states, part of the reason, quite frankly, why there's a lot of reluctance and resistance to the idea of having the Social Security system move towards covering all of the newly hired state and locals, is that whereas the state and local government plans are supposed to all be fully advance funded, so that all of the obligations that have developed based on earnings in the past, there's funding to cover those obligations in the future. Not all the state and local governments have been perfect on that. They're not all fully advance funded, so that if suddenly we had no new stream of employees coming in, that a lot of those plans would be caught somewhat short, and there would have to be more money coming from the states to, in effect, sort of close out those plans. And there's some reluctance on that basis. There's also, frankly, some reluctance also in many state and local areas where people believe they're getting a better deal from their state and local plan than they would be getting under Social Security. Back in 1983, when those amendments were enacted into law, there was sort of a stop-loss provision that was enacted that said no new state and local governments can drop out of Social Security. So all those that were covered at the time are required to stay in Social Security. Nobody further can drop out. But we could have some of those plans voluntarily enter into Social Security, and we actually do have some of that over time. So the basic question, I think, is that there would be some strain on some of the state and local governments of doing this, and therefore there's some resistance.
Go ahead. Yes.
If you can broaden the scope a little bit and tell us what you think can be learned from the experiences of other countries, if any.
Okay, well, one thing we have certainly seen is, that Europe and Japan are way ahead of us. They got a head start on aging, and they're aging to a much greater extent. And they're facing some real issues. I think you've probably heard things like in Germany, they've actually gone back and made some substantial reductions in their general benefit levels. A number of other countries have really reduced their benefit levels a lot. Some of them have gone in and have created sort of individual account structures. Chile, you've probably heard of. Mexico has moved towards sort of an individual account structure. There are lots of different approaches to this. One of the things I think to keep in mind in terms of moving towards having a system that would have more advanced funding is exactly as you suggest, sort of broaden the scope. Are there other reasons in the society for which we would want to create more advanced funding in Social Security to create more capital investment? That's probably not our biggest problem in the United States. We're clearly a capitalistic society. We have lots of investment and going on in this country. There seems to be no shortage of that. Many other countries, like Chile, for example, when they moved towards having an individual account system, it was really to create a capital-based society and to have money available. So we don't have that impetus for doing it.
Yes, in front.
Thank you, Professor Chen, for organizing the meeting. And also, my concern with the private accounts are the fees that are going to go to Wall Street, that the assumptions are they're going to be very low, but the experience of other countries, such as Britain, where they've had scandals around the fees in private accounts, in Chile, how are we going to be so certain that, given all the Wall Street scandals that are in the news, that people aren't going to be taken advantage of?
Very, very good question, and this really just depends on how you do it. So far, the first real sort of set of proposals that we saw that would include individual accounts were back at the 1994-6 Advisory Council. And they came up with two plans that would have individual accounts. One of them would have individual accounts where everybody would go out and basically go to the corner broker with their money and go out and, just invest it. sort of like you would do with an IRA. The other plan was said to be something more like what the government employees have available in the so-called thrift savings plan, which would be a centrally managed system where basically the records for your earnings would be transferred directly from the Social Security Administration, which has all the records anyway, so this would be free of charge, and it would go to the central administrative authority. It would be something like Social Security, and it would keep records of how much each of you had going in. And then here's the good part. The good part is that all the money from all of us, let's say we all wanted to have some of the money invested in a Fidelity fund that was available. We would take all the dollars that each one of us said we wanted invested in the Fidelity fund, this one central administrative authority would pull it all together up into billions and billions of dollars and invest it in one chunk with the Fidelity fund. We wouldn't be going over and keeping separate little accounting systems for each one of us with Fidelity. It would come in a gigantic chunk of money. Now, we've been told, and we see through the experience of what the government employee thrift savings plan has, if you do that, the administrative expense is virtually nil. There's almost no expense at all for the investment phase of it. The only administrative expense, therefore, really turns out to be just sort of keeping records by the central administrative authority. Our experience so far in talking with people over in Capitol Hill with members of Congress is we say, now, how do you want to structure your individual accounts for people who want to have these accounts? Do you want to do them like that PSA plan where people go out to the brokers themselves, in which case we estimate that the cost is going to be at least 1% per year of assets, maybe more than that, which is about in line with what mutual funds are. If, on the other hand, you want to go with something more like this government employee thrift savings plan, a centrally administered sort of low-service deal where you can only change your mind about how you want your money allocated once a year, limited reporting requirements, et cetera, then we estimate that this could be done for maybe 25 or 30 basis points, or about 0.25 to 0.3% per year. That's actually quite a bit higher than the government employee thrift savings plan, which is now down less than 0.1% per year. So I don't think we're being overly conservative on that, but we want to make sure that we're not underestimating what the administrative costs would be. So far, I'm happy to mention that every member of Congress that's come up with a plan has said, we want the cheap way. We want to have the central administrative authority, and that should not be surprising.
There's a lady over here in a red suit who's had her hand up a lot.
I have sort of a two-part question. One is nobody's talked about how this will affect women who traditionally don't contribute as much because of time out of the workforce, having children, raising children. And I'm also wondering if you could comment on how some of the proposals would affect disability benefits and widows' benefits.
Great questions. First of all, on affecting women. Well, unfortunately, like with everything else, there's more than one kind of woman out there. And as many of you are probably aware, the way the current Social Security system is structured, and when we have cases where
do you want to clarify why you said unfortunately before you go forward and get jumped in the parking lot?
I take that back. It's unfortunate in that the nature of the system now sort of gives the appearance of treating women who are in different kinds of work environments differently, and there's some tension on that. Right now, as you all know, with the current Social Security benefit structure, if you have, say, a married couple, one works and the other doesn't work, that there's a spouse benefit available for the individual who doesn't work, whether it's the husband or the wife. The Social Security is completely gender neutral. It makes no distinction between men and women. Historically, it was more often the case, I guess, that men would be working and women wouldn't. And right now, we have about 10% of our beneficiary population are made up of these so-called one-earner couples. We estimate in 50, 75 years, it's going to be more like only about 5% of the beneficiary population will be these one-earner couples, maybe even less. But historically, the current system has, in fact, been, in essence, a better deal for these one-earner couples. And the reason is because Social Security has always been set up as being a mix between individual equity and the adequacy of the benefits. And historically, the people who put together Social Security decided that that's something that they wanted and the population wanted. If you had a one-earner couple, that there would be something more paid to that couple than if that one-earner had been single and never married, to sort of provide a more adequate benefit. Now, what this means, of course, though, is now if you have a more modern couple, I don't know if more modern is quite the right word, but if you have what's come to be a very modern couple where both the husband and wife are working, well, if both husband and wife are working and they have fairly similar careers, there's not going to be any spouse benefit. Each of them is going to get just their worker benefit, no spouse benefit paid. Therefore, the amount of money they get back relative to the taxes they paid in won't be as high as the one-earner couple. Now, you can take this as being a good thing or a bad thing. This is really just what the system does. And again, it's because of this mix between the individual equity versus the sort of social adequacy of the program. Now, what did individual accounts do for this? Well, individual accounts, basically, if you have a worker who's single and you have a worker who is married with a non-working spouse, and they both have the same job, they'll both put the same amount of money into the individual account. And then when they go and retire, they'll have the same amount of money built up in the individual account. And what can they do with it then? Well, if they both buy an annuity, the single worker will buy an annuity for just that one person, a single life annuity, and get, say, like $900 a month going forward. If the other worker has a spouse and they buy a joint and survivor annuity, the price you pay for having an annuity that will pay as long as either one of them is alive is that you'll get less monthly benefit. So under that kind of structure, not only will there not be sort of a larger monthly benefit for the one earner couple than for the single person, it would actually be a smaller monthly amount. And it's really because of things like this that would operate under individual accounts that all of the plans that we've looked at operate in a way where if you had individual accounts, they would be something that would sort of augment in some way the basic kinds of benefits that we have under current law. Generally, the kinds of benefits we have under current law would still be responsible for sort of creating these social adequacy kinds of benefits, and the individual accounts would by their very nature be much more sort of the equity-based kind of aspects of the program. So it would be sort of splitting responsibilities.
The lady also mentioned disability payments.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Disability benefits, again, there's a choice here, and we've seen plans that would go both ways. Most of the plans we've seen recently have suggested that because individual accounts are a mechanism by which you can save money up throughout your whole career towards retirement, and individual accounts or any kind of savings can be affected for that. As we all know, if you have a good long career, you can save money towards your retirement. But individual accounts are not a good mechanism to save money up towards possibly becoming disabled at age 25 or 30 years of age. There's just not enough time. You really need to have insurance for that purpose. That's why all the plans we have would retain, in fact, I think the President has as one of his principles, that you would retain the disability program much as we have it now. Most of the plans would even say that the benefit levels we have scheduled under current law for disability insurance would not be tampered with. They would not be touched. You'd retain the same benefit levels for as long as a person was a disabled worker beneficiary, that is up until they reach their normal retirement age, now about 66. And the only exception to this is once you reach the normal retirement age and become sort of a retirement age person, then you might have some reduction to your disability benefits, but really essentially in keeping with the number of years you had that you were contributing to your individual account. So if you had half of a normal career before you came disabled contributing to your individual account, you'd have sort of half of the reduction that other retired workers who had never become disabled would have, because you'd have about half of the individual account to augment it. So the bottom line, though, is that most of the plans nowadays are saying that disability benefits up until reaching retirement age would not be touched. They'd be the same as under present law.
From the proposed changes you've been looking at in Social Security, what is the youngest age at which a worker would have to start worrying about changes affecting them? Like a lot of seniors who are currently retired are worried that they're going to lose their Social Security. Do people like that have to worry? Or what, does a 50-year-old need to look at the plan, or a 60-year-old, or what do you think?
The youngest age that we've seen where any of the plans that would really affect people are people who are 55 and under essentially today. I believe the President's plan that he put forth, it had some details, not a huge number, but one of the details it had is that people who are 55 or over as of the beginning of 2005 would not be touched by this. People who are not yet 55 at the beginning of 2005 will reach 55 or some younger age during 2005, then those people would be potentially affected by this. Other plans have gone even further. Chuck Hagel from Nebraska put forth a proposal that we worked on recently that would set that age at 45. So people who are now 45 and under would be ones who would be affected. People who are over 45 would not be affected by his proposal.
Yes, sir. I don't know if we can get somebody to run over there to you. All right.
The last few questions that you had right down the line of what I've been thinking a lot about, and that is that Social Security is not just an investment fund. It's not just about retirement. It's about a variety of social insurances. And for one thing, it protects not just individuals, it protects society from having to take care of people who otherwise couldn't take care of themselves. And I think one thing that has seldom been mentioned here is that the individual retirement accounts have no PIA formula, no Ben points. The poor people are going to be not nearly as well taken care of, and society is probably going to have to take care of them. The big appeal that's often made has been that the private account will be my account. I don't have to share it with anybody else. I call it antisocial insecurity. But is it true that most of the plans for private accounts make no provision for the kind of progressive features that protect society?
Well, actually, in fairness, I guess you'd have to say, for better or for worse, your monthly benefit that you might receive from Social Security, you don't have to share with anybody either. So that is your benefit. And there was a comment earlier about the progressivity of Social Security, or about the tax rates that we pay now as being regressive. If you look at the tax rates alone, they may appear regressive because it's a flat tax rate and only up to a certain level. But as you indicate, the PIA formula, the basic benefit formula we have now, is a rather progressive benefit formula, and that means the overall structure of Social Security really does become progressive. Now, your point about individual accounts, can they also be progressive? And this is a very interesting point. The first plan that we looked at was back in the late 90s with a guy named John Kasich from Ohio, and he said he wanted to come up with an individual account that would in fact be progressive. Don't just take 2% for everybody or 3% and put it into account, but give a larger percentage for low-income people and a smaller percentage of earnings for people who are high income, and put them into the individual accounts. And since that original work on that kind of a structure, many plans, in fact most plans now are structured in that way. The individual accounts under the President's Commission back in 2001 for the most often cited Model 2 would have 4% of your pay, but with a maximum of $1,000. What that would mean is for the lowest earners, people earning $25,000 or less, they'd have a full 4% go in. But a person who is, say, at $90,000, if they put in $1,000, that's only about 1 1/8% for the highest earners. So it is possible to have progressivity even in the individual accounts on an earnings level basis. What's harder to create progressivity in the individual accounts, though, is on the point made earlier. If you have a situation where you have a one-earner couple, it's more difficult to create the kind of progressivity that the current system can provide in that case.
But a big part of this discussion is really values as much as it's funding, right? Values as a country, and what do we believe in and what do we want to do?
Absolutely, no question about it. It's I guess it's about values. It's what people prefer, which is why it's so great to have a representative democracy. All of you raise your voices to your members of Congress, send your cards and letters in about what your preference is. And it's really, I think, fundamentally at this point, some discussion about whether or not, given the demographics of the country, we want to move towards having some more advanced funding in Social Security. And if we do want to have more advanced funding, do we want to do it through having money invested in the trust funds or money invested in the individual accounts? There are plus and minuses both ways. And we've got 535 members of Congress who are going to be the ones who are going to be making the decisions on this. So if you have views and opinions on this, I would encourage you to get in touch with them.
Okay. Jen.
Has there been any move in the Congress to require that surplus funds that are used for other purposes, such as reducing the income tax on dividends and to finance the present deficit that we're in? Has there been any attempt done to require some sort of compensation We get the criticism that we're going to run out, the Social Security is going to run out in 2020 or 40 or 60. There's a question of equity here, I think.
I think your question is, are there other sort of sources of revenue that could be brought into Social Security?
Shouldn't there be an interest-bearing account on the monies that are used for non-Social Security purposes by the government?
Okay, interest-bearing account for monies that are used for not. Okay, I think what you're getting at is sort of the concept that we talked about some years ago called the lockbox. Okay.
Al Gore brought that up.
Al Gore talked about it. I think Clinton talked about it. And back in the time when we were looking at having the federal government, the on-budget, that is the non-Social Security portion of the government operating in a balanced budget situation where it didn't need to make use of the extra monies coming in from Social Security, then the question is, what would happen with the money, the excess money that was coming from Social Security? Well, what actually happened at that time frame is, if Social Security had, say, $100 billion more coming in taxes than it needed, and the rest of the government was in balance, it was meeting its obligations with current taxes, that $100 billion would be given to Treasury for the bonds, and the Treasury would actually go and retire $100 billion worth of publicly held debt. It would go back and it would call in or not reissue a bunch of Treasury bonds, a bunch of savings bonds. So the actual size of the publicly held debt would actually have gone down as Social Security's investments would have gone up. It would have required a change in the law for Social Security to directly go out and buy corporate bonds or buy stocks, and we don't really have the ability to do that just as yet. But I think the thing to keep in mind with respect to this idea of the so-called lockbox, as it was envisioned then, a lockbox happens automatically in this sense if the rest of the budget of the government is in balance. So if the rest of the budget is in balance and Social Security is running a surplus, then basically the rest of the government has no way to spend the money, because by definition it's met its other obligations, and that money can only be used then to sort of bring down the level of the publicly held debt, which therefore should in effect allow the government to have more breathing room to reissue publicly held debt later and make it easier to be able to sort of finance cashing in Social Security's bonds at a later time. Right now we're not in a position where the rest of the government is in balance. It's the government in general is running deficits. So we're issuing a fair amount of debt to the public at this time.
That brings me to a question I'd like to ask, because they're talking about a $10.4 trillion shortfall for Social Security, but a $17 trillion deficit for Medicare. And those things certainly kind of go hand in glove as far as the people who depend on them. So what about that? Shouldn't we be really focusing on Medicare instead?
Well, very good points. I mean, first, just a quick note about these sort of like trillions of dollars numbers, just to sort of keep them in perspective, because I mean, I don't know how many rooms this size you would fill with $1 trillion $1 bills, because, you know, $1 trillion is 1 million piles of 1 million each. And that's like a lot, but in any case. So these trillions of dollars, when you hear the number $4 trillion, as Margie mentioned, that's over the next 75 years as a whole, the sort of shortfall that we have that we do not have enough money coming in. Now, 75 years is a pretty long period of time, and that's a shortfall that we're going to have to meet over a period of 75 years. It's not a shortfall that we have today, that we have to meet today. It's something that we have to find the money for by either reducing benefits or increasing revenues over the next 75 years as a whole. Another number that's sort of out there is the $11 trillion number for the infinite future for Social Security, and the infinite future is a little longer even than 75 years, which means, of course, we have a very long period of time over which to come up with either benefit cuts or additional revenue that totals the equivalent of $11 trillion. So you want to keep those numbers kind of in perspective. Actually, the $11 trillion even translates into about 3.5% of Social Security's payroll and about 1.2% of gross domestic product over the infinite horizon in the future. So, but Margie's other question is, now, how about Medicare? Well, Medicare is indeed a bigger problem in terms of the finances going forward. And the reason it's projected to be a bigger problem is not only do we have the demographic curves that we see going on with the lower birth rates and therefore a bigger ratio of beneficiaries to workers, or fewer workers per beneficiary going in the future, but in addition, the trustees are projecting that the sort of cost per person of Medicare is going to be going up in the future. Why? Because of all the things that we want. We want to have new medical technologies. We want to have new medical breakthroughs. We want to have new things that will keep us healthier and happier and living longer, but all these things cost a lot of money. And if they happen anything like the rate that has happened in the past, it's going to be very expensive. So the real question is, how are we going to pay for this? And the question for Medicare is really a lot broader than Medicare alone. The trustees' projections are that we're going to go from having about 13 or 14% of the total output of this country, total gross domestic product, going for health expenditures, to being well over 40% in 75 years from now. That's a big jump. Is that possible? Is that plausible to happen? Probably. You know, there's only so many sport utes you probably want to buy, especially with the current cost of gas. So at some point, you'll top out in the number of VCRs and sport utes that you own, and maybe you'll want to spend the rest of the money on health expenditures. But there may be limits in terms of how much you want to spend there, too. Clearly, we need, as a nation, to face what's going on in the health area, lest we get in a situation like in the United Kingdom, for example, where they've handled their health costs by simply having people stand in the queues and wait for their turn to see a doctor. And we certainly don't want to see that in this country.
Right. Thank you so much, Stephen Goss. A tremendous job. Really appreciate it. Thank you. The Chancellor is not able to be with us. He was going to do the final comments and said Bing Chen is going to wrap it up. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. I can assure you the Chancellor is not in Fenway Park. He has an unavoidable conflict that just came upon the university. That's why he's not here. I am handed 3 pages of his remarks, so that will take at least 15 minutes. No, just kidding. He wants me to thank our speaker, obviously, and would like to thank our moderator, and in his very gracious way, he wants to thank the department, the Gerontology Department and the Gerontology Institute for staging this particular forum. In addition, he wanted to thank all of you for being here and sticking to the end. Now let me say just a word about our speaker. When I first met him, it was 27 years ago. When I saw a young actuary, I actually saw a supervisory actuary in him, and he became a supervisory actuary. When he became a supervisory actuary, I saw him as deputy chief actuary, and he became one. And when he was that, I saw a chief actuary in him, and he became one. And now, for several years since he became chief actuary, I saw a future commissioner of Social Security in Steve Goss. And thank you all very much for being here.